Hello, I'm Dale Yurton, and welcome to our study on leadership. I'm talking about different leadership principles, and I can remember this particular subject I'm going to deal with today. I'm calling connecting. Connecting. It's been several years ago now that I came across this concept that there's basically 5 different groups of people that follow every leader. And when I saw that, I suddenly realized that Jesus understood that principle. Jesus knew that he had different groups of people that were following him, so he dealt with each of them in an individual way. For instance, let's look at the problem of the resurrection. In Matthew, the 28th chapter, verse 17, it said, when they saw him, it's talking about a large group of people, estimated 500 people that were there, they worshiped him. That meant they believed. But then the very next statement says, but some doubted. Some doubted. So Jesus understands that. The greatest of all the miracles of Jesus was his resurrection. And because it was the greatest of all his miracles, of him being raised from the dead, it also become the most difficult to believe. Is he really alive? And so because Jesus understood that, he, dealing with these 5 different groups of people, he takes the time which is necessary to convince his disciples that he was really, truly alive. I want us to show you how that he does this. Here's the first group that we will talk about. This is a very small group of people, but it's what we call the committed. The committed. These are the people that are closest to us. We might say they're the people that have heard our heartbeat and have bought into our vision. In this story, it would be John the beloved. The Bible said it that last night as they gathered together for what we call the Last Supper, that John leaned his head on Jesus' chest. He's so close, he can hear Jesus' heartbeat. Now, those that are that close to us, all that is necessary for them is just give them little hints. That's all it's necessary for us to convince them that Jesus is really alive. For instance, in this story of Jesus, his resurrection, there's an interesting insert that is made about him coming out of the tomb. This is John the 20th chapter, verse 8. It said the handkerchief that had been around his head, what we would call the face cloth, it was not lying with the other linen cloths, but folded together in a place by itself. Now, the question you have to ask is, why would Jesus do that? Why would Jesus take the time to take the face cloth off and fold it neatly and lay it aside by itself? Well, when you read the story, it becomes obvious why he did that. He did it because he knew that John would be looking for little things that he could say, that's Jesus. And the Bible said when John saw that face cloth lying by itself, he believed. That's all it took. He said, that's Jesus. Jesus would do that. He understood because he was so close to Jesus. It was just the little hints, the little things which we do that convinces them this is Jesus. This is the right way. This resurrection, it's the real thing. He became the first believer in the resurrection because of the face cloth, the little thing that Jesus did. Now, there's a second group of people, and again, this is not a large group, it's a smaller group. They say that the ones that are easiest convinced are only about 6%. They estimate the second group, the easily convinced, as being about 10%. So again, we're not talking about large groups here. Another small group is the easily convinced. In this story of Jesus, we will talk about how he dealt with Simon Peter. It took more than a piece of cloth to convince Peter. Peter was right there with John. When John saw the face cloth, he believed. Peter didn't. It took more than that for him. He had saw what John saw, but still he didn't believe in the resurrection. The problem is, and Jesus understood this very clearly, Peter is the leader. He's the first one to go into the tomb. He saw the face cloth, no doubt, probably even before John saw it, but he didn't pay any attention. But Jesus understood because John was a strong leader. People liked him. People would follow him even when he was wrong. There's a classic story that's given in John the 21st chapter, verse 3. Simon Peter said to them, "I am going fishing." Now, I need to pause there for a moment because he's not just talking about going out recreationally fishing and just get something to eat. No. He's literally saying, I'm going back into the fishing business. That's what I was doing when I met Jesus. I'm going back to fishing. And it said, and they said, we are going with you also. They're following their leader. They went out and immediately got into the boat, and that night they caught nothing. Now I want you to notice what Jesus does. Jesus takes the time to set up an experience that he knew Peter would understand. This is key. And as leaders, we must do the same thing for the strong leaders that are following us. So in John the 21st chapter and verse 9, it says, as soon as they had come to land, they saw a fire of coals there, and fish laid on it, and bread. Now what is Jesus doing? He's prepared breakfast for them. The question is, why did Jesus take the time to cook fish on the seashore? It's obvious. He has invaded Peter's world. He's sitting where Peter sits. He has become a part of his world, which was fishing. Jesus understood exactly what's going on. In fact, I'm sure he probably had something to do with they had fished all night and caught nothing. Jesus knew that. And so the first thing he says, he calls out to them, do you have any fish? And they said, no, we don't have anything. We've caught nothing. Now what Jesus does, he begins to lead Peter through let's call it a discovery process. And the way he did it was by asking him good questions. Now I want to emphasize this because if you're going to be a good leader, you've got to learn to ask good questions. And that's what he begins to do with Peter. He begins to ask him questions that makes him think. What Jesus is doing by preparing the food and feeding them, he's turning it into what we will call a total learning experience. He not only hears the questions and thinks about it, but he can smell the fish cooking and he can taste the food. He's invaded his world. Much of Peter's problem goes back to his denial of Jesus. 3 times Peter had denied that he knew Jesus. No, I am not one of his disciples. I don't know this man. 3 times he denied him. And so what Jesus does, he gives him the opportunity to reaffirm his faith. He says to him 3 times, you'll find this in John the 21st chapter and verse 17, Simon, son of Jonah, do you love me? Wow. The Bible said after the third time, Peter was grieved because he said to him the third time, "Do you love me?" And he said to him, "Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you." What is Jesus doing? Jesus is making Peter think about what he has done, his life. And he's giving him the opportunity to reaffirm his faith. Do you love me? And of course, if you read it from the Greek language, in the Greek, Jesus is using the word agape there, which means an unconditional love. And Peter responds with a different Greek word, phileo, which means I love you like a friend. And Jesus, do you have unconditional love? But the third time, Jesus says to him, "Do you love me like a friend?" And that's when it said that Peter was grieved. But Jesus is giving him the time to process this, to think it through. Understand what you're saying, Peter. Understand what you're doing. Now, here's my point. If we take the time to convince them, they will follow us to the cross. That's what history records about Simon Peter. Only it says of Simon that he was crucified upside down because he said, "I'm not worthy to be crucified like him. So crucify me upside down." If we take the time to convince them, and that's what Jesus is doing, step by step, he's taking Peter through this process. And I encourage you to do the same thing. There are some good people. There are people that love you. There are people that believe in the vision. They just got to be convinced this is what they need to be doing. Now, let me talk about the third group. The third group is what we will call it the early majority. Now, the reason we're calling it a majority is because it's a large group. This group is twice as big as the first two groups put together. The first two groups, they estimate them about 16%. The early majority, they estimated about 34%. A large group in the early majority. And when you read this story in John, the 21st chapter, there are 7 disciples that are following Peter. And there's only 11 disciples that remain. Judas, of course, has fallen from his position. So there's only 11. This is 7 of the 11 disciples that remain. So in John 21 in verse 12, Jesus said to them, "Come and eat breakfast." Yet none of the disciples dared to ask him, "Who are you?" knowing it was the Lord. Wow, what a tremendous statement. How did Jesus convince them? The majority of people in life are looking for strong leaders to follow. It's estimated that approximately 75% of people are what we call phlegmatic. They're easy to get along with. They want to work together in unity. They enjoy working as a group. They're looking for strong leaders to follow. That's what Jesus is providing for them. And so how does Jesus convince them? He offers them food. Food. Come and eat. Now, again, the question is, why would he do that? It's very simple, my friend. The reason Jesus did it is because people will follow whoever feeds them. I'm talking to some of you that are pastors, spiritual leaders. Don't ever go to the pulpit unprepared. Never stand before your group of people without having studied and being ready to speak to them. They can always tell when you're not prepared. God help us not to do it. Jesus never made that mistake. and he's not making it here. He deliberately, intentionally is feeding them because he understands whoever feeds them, they will follow them. And that's what it says in this story, that they knew it was the Lord. God help us to learn from this. Do you see what Jesus is doing? He's not rushing through this. No, there's no mistakes about this. No, he's doing everything step by step intentionally because he's convincing them, I am truly alive. He knew they would never follow a dead leader. So he's convincing them the resurrection is real. I am truly alive. Now let me talk about a fourth group of people. The fourth group of people is what I will call the late bloomers. The late bloomers. What I mean by that is these are the people that follow slowly, step by step by step. Now when it comes to John, just the little hints convince him. Peter, when John turned to him and said, it's the Lord, the Bible said he jumped overboard to swim to Jesus. That's Peter. Peter's one of those leaders. He's always, ready to go. But in this last fourth group, they're what we call late bloomers. They don't run to it, but if you convince them, they're some of your most faithful followers. These people have what I would call honest doubts. Honest doubts. In other words, they've got some questions that they need answered. And if you'll take the time to answer their questions, they will follow you. What you have to remember is we're asking them to believe the impossible. For Jesus, I saw him die. I saw his tomb. He's dead. We're asking them to believe the impossible. When it comes to being a spiritual leader, I've discovered the same thing. Many times I will stand before a congregation and I will say, God spoke to me. Now, unless they trust me, they're not going to follow me because they didn't hear anything. They didn't see anything. And you've got to convince them. How do you do it? By answering their questions. When it comes to Simon Peter, you got to ask him questions and lead him through the process. But now you've got to answer their questions. For instance, in the story of the resurrection, in John the 20th chapter and verse 25 is talking about the disciple Thomas. The other disciples said to him, to Thomas, we have seen the Lord. So he said to them, unless I see in his hands the print of the nails and put my hand into his side, I will not believe. Thomas. We call him Doubting Thomas. But the truth is, he had good reason for that. They're saying something that sounds completely impossible. And so as they're gathered together there, Jesus appears to them. And when he does, he says to Thomas, here's the nail prints. Put your finger there. Here's my side. Feel my side. And it says in verse 29, John 20 and 29, Thomas answered and said to him, to Jesus, my Lord and my God. Jesus said to him, Thomas, because you have seen me, you have believed. But blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed. Now, the question is, how did Jesus convince Thomas that he was alive? The answer is, he showed him his scars. This is what's been described as leading from vulnerability. Showed him his scars. He's willing to talk about those negative things in life. Now, I need to point out there's a big difference between a wound and a scar. A wound and a scar. A wound is It's still open and bleeding. You're still hurting. Don't show them your wounds. No, it's too much. And you haven't healed and overcome that yet. He did not show him his wounds. He showed him his scars. What is a scar? A scar is a place where we have hurt in the past, but we've been healed of that. We've been healed from whatever had cut us, whatever had caused us to bleed. We're healed now, and we can talk about it without pain, without bitterness. So he shows him his scars. Now, here's what I want to point out to you. In this story with Thomas, it's not enough for us to touch them. We must permit them to touch us, to touch our humanity, to teach us, as I said, to touch our vulnerabilities. So many people don't understand God became a man. He dwelt among us. He was tempted in every point like you and I are tempted. That's why we follow him, is because he overcame. And because he overcame, it gives us faith to know that he will help us to overcome also. You've got to permit them to touch you. Now, I see a lot of leaders that they hesitate to do this because they're afraid that they will lose the people's respect. I've discovered it's the opposite that is true. I can remember times when, as a parent, that I make a bad decision concerning my girls. I'm not talking about being evil. I'm just saying I made a mistake. And when I was big enough to say to them, I'm sorry, I made a mistake. I should have, and I'll tell them what I should have done. They actually respected me more because I was willing to admit I had been wrong, that I had made a mistake, leading from vulnerability. When we're willing to do that, then this group of people, they identify with our pain and they feel what we felt. The truth of it is, there are many people in life that are following their feelings. Their feelings are very important to them. And if they can feel it, then they can overcome it. They can do it. But if they don't feel it, and I understand that is a weakness, but the truth of it is that's where many people live. That's where they are. Jesus took the time to stretch out his hand. He did not rebuke Thomas. He didn't say, why are you such a big unbeliever? No, there was no rebuke at all. He just stretches out his hand and says, put your finger in the nail print. Oh, that moves me so deeply because that is leading from vulnerability. The truth is, if people like Thomas, if they can feel it, they'll be willing to die for it. When you look back through history, it was Thomas. He traveled farther than any of the other apostles traveled. I'm talking about the original 12. Farther than Peter went, farther than John went. He traveled all the way to eastern India and died as a martyr. One of the great experiences in my travels was to be able to go to the tomb of Thomas in India and see where they buried this great man of God. If we take the time with these, what we call late bloomers, they're one of the largest groups of those that follow us. And if we'll answer their questions, if we'll let them touch us, they will follow us. Now, this is what in leadership principles, this is called the tipping point. And what they mean at that point, you now have the majority. It's like 80-some% of the people that are now following you. And when you reach that, you don't have to worry about anything else. Because if we patiently answer them, they become some of our most loyal followers. And we now can lead successfully. The fifth group, and I will only say a few words concerning this. It's what we call the holdouts. The holdouts. Of course, Judas is the example here. The truth is, there is nothing we can do to win the confidence of the holdouts. I hate to say that, but it's the truth. Jesus knew that. He knew he could not win the confidence of Judas, but he didn't spend a lot of time crying over him. It's one of the mistakes that I have made in life. I spent too much time crying over Judas, trying to win Judas. No, you're never going to win him. You've just got to let him go. Jesus allowed Judas to kiss him, but it was the kiss of goodbye. And so what I say to you is, stop fretting over things you can't control and spend your time doing something that is productive. That's what Jesus did. You don't see him spending time fretting over Judas. Jesus understood the principle. If we win the confidence of the first four groups, we don't have to worry about the holdouts. The holdouts are a small group. They estimate approximately 16% of people. It does not matter what you do or say, they are not going to follow you. The best thing you can do is just let them go. Say goodbye. And the word that Jesus used, friend, we could say Mr. And he's just a polite term. He's letting him go. And that's what you have to do with the holdouts. I pray that this lesson on connecting shows you what you need to do as a leader to be able to connect with good people. And they will follow you, just like the disciples of Jesus followed him all the way to the cross.